Hi, I'm Tom, and I enjoy making travel videos, but they've usually been about wildlife or scenery. But recently my wife Jenny and I took a expeditionary cruise to the Arctic, and having taken a previous expeditionary cruise to the Galapagos, I realized there were some questions I had before we left that I really never got answered. And it wasn't until I took the cruise that the answers came to light. So then it dawned on me that maybe it'd be beneficial to make a video with some tips about expeditionary cruises. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is frequently expeditionary cruises are on people's bucket list. And so they want to make sure everything is perfect. In this video, I'm going to make some tips specific to the Arctic. So for tip number one, let's discuss what an expeditionary cruise is like. If you're used to taking a mass market type ship cruise to the Caribbean, for example, you might have a preconceived notion of what the ship atmosphere is going to be like. The mass market ships, they're a heavy focus on entertainment, right? They have multiple venues for, say, music, magic shows, even Broadway level shows. And they have many people on the crew assigned to that task of entertaining the passengers. On an expeditionary cruise, the entertainers are replaced by either expeditionary guides or subject matter experts on nature, animals, and the environment. And what about wildlife? Of course, everybody wants to see wildlife, including in the Arctic, the polar bear. And though everyone wants to see the wildlife, it's not as prevalent in the Arctic. And the captain and the crew are going to do whatever they can to help get these animal sightings, but it's just the animals aren't as prevalent there. One really interesting thing about the cruise is it didn't have a set itinerary, and the captain explained this to us on the first day. The reason for this is that the captain has to take into consideration the weather and winds, but not only that, but the sea ice as well. So the ship we were on was not an icebreaker. The captain had to continually assess what locations were not only accessible but safe to go to. Sometimes animal sightings might factor into this and change the destination. Because of all these factors, plan change frequently, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. So let's move on to tip number 2. In tip number 1, I was talking about what an expeditionary cruise is like, and so this was geared more towards people that are considering taking a cruise and trying to decide whether they want to do that. Now I'm going to move on to information that's more relevant to people that have already booked a cruise, and that's what clothes should I bring on the cruise. When I researched this before our trip, I found that the ship and other websites had information, but it seemed like some of the items were unnecessary. But I was concerned about not following their recommendations and then being miserable on the trip. Well, let's discuss the environment and what it's like on the excursions. When we were in the Arctic in June-July timeframe, the temperatures were cold, but they were above freezing, typically about 37 to 40 degrees. My initial reaction when I was planning for this trip was I've experienced these temperatures before and wouldn't normally go out with a whole lot of layers on if I was at home. This ended up being a valid observation. But what about the conditions you're going to experience on an excursion? Well, typically the excursion is about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. And let's talk about the Zodiac excursion first. When riding on the Zodiac, the boat is moving, but you're not, so you're not generating any heat. This combined with the wind generated by the boat movement can make it quite cold. During land excursions, there's 2 things to consider. The first is if you're going to be hiking up a large hill during direct sunlight, then wearing too many layers is going to be quite hot. The second is getting to land, you're going to be making a wet landing from the Zodiac, which means you have to step in the water in order to get on land. And rain needs to also be considered. We were lucky and only had 1 day of light rain, but you should keep in mind and prepare for rain and overcast skies. Okay, Tom, so what do you recommend? Our ship provided us with a parka and waterproof boots. This was fantastic because both these items were absolutely required. And what about other required items? The first is a knit hat. Yes, the parka has a hat, and it comes in handy when it's extremely windy or raining, but when you use the hat on the parka, it obscures your vision to the side, or peripheral vision as we call it in the business. Gloves is another must-have, and I don't recommend that you get anything fancy here, just the typical gloves you might wear out in winter in your home. Waterproof pants are also necessary, and they don't once again have to be fancy, but they just need to protect you against the rain and those wet landings from the Zodiac. A recommendation here is for those pants to have a zipper on the legs, that way you can get them over the top of the boots and not have to tuck them in. So what about what layers to wear? So websites I researched talk about bringing perhaps 4 bona fide layers and even have links to very high-end gear. I went with things that I already had, and I would say I wore about 2.5 layers. On my upper body, I wore just a short sleeve shirt, a tech bro pullover, and then the parka. On my lower body, I wore long underwear, pants, and then the waterproof pants. What I want to point out here is this list is a long way from the 4 or 5 layer doomsday scenario that some websites present. All right, let's go on to tip 3, or 3 depending on where you're from. I enjoy taking a lot of pictures and video, so what camera gear to bring was a big concern for me. Here are a couple things that I wasn't sure about before the trip, but became clear once I had taken the trip. You're going to want a long zoom lens to photograph wildlife. I have a Nikon mirrorless camera, and in the Galapagos I had a 24 to 120 millimeter zoom, and that worked great there because you can get pretty close to the animals. But in the Arctic, the 120 just wasn't enough. And here's why. In the Arctic, you're limited to how close you can get to the wildlife. For example, the polar bear, if there's one sighted, you can't be on shore with them, which makes sense on the Darwin scale, but makes it difficult for taking pictures. Also, there's a standoff distance from walrus, which in our case were increased because of the presence of walrus pups, as we call them. So all the wildlife we witnessed on the trip was either from the ship or the Zodiac and at a distance. Having a lens that went to 300 or even 400 millimeters would have been helpful, or in some cases really even more. And video is similar. If you're interested in taking videos of the wildlife, the same emphasis on a good zoom capability applies. However, I found that a lot of the video I took I could have done mostly with my cell phone, especially if I shot in 4K so I could crop it later. My advice here is if you enjoy taking video, consider bringing a gimbal, which if you shoot with a cell phone, the gimbals are fairly inexpensive to either buy or rent. The reason for this, most of the good video comes when you're in the Zodiac, which is continually rocking and turning, so having a gimbal will immensely help your video. Let's move on to tip number 4 about miscellaneous equipment. The first was a waterproof backpack. The ship recommended a waterproof backpack, but I found it was unnecessary, and I would say 95% of the people on the excursions didn't bring them. If you do feel like you want to bring one, the other piece of advice is a water-resistant one is probably good enough. Another thing you might want to consider when going on a trip to the Arctic is bringing some kind of clips like alligator or hair clips that you can use on your curtain. When you're in the Arctic in the summer, the sun just doesn't go down. And here's a picture of our cabin at midnight. Our ship had very good blackout curtains, but there's always that gap between the curtains. So if you're sensitive to light while you're sleeping, I recommend bringing some kind of clips. As I mentioned, most of the wildlife we saw was from a distance, so I definitely recommend binoculars. If your ship doesn't provide them, I would recommend getting some and bringing them.